I always knew my dad wasn't my biological father, but I never imagined that the truth about my real dad would turn my entire life upside down, shatter a marriage, turn my family against me, and maybe even save my life. And it all started with a lie I believed for 19 years. I always knew something about my family wasn't exactly like the picture-perfect stories in movies or the Instagram posts people post of their happy little families. My name's Ethan, I'm 19 now, and growing up in a small town in Ohio, I had the usual mix of normal teenage ups and downs. Sports, friends, school, drama, you know, the usual. But there was always this quiet truth hovering in the background. The man I called Dad. The one who cheered the loudest at my soccer games, who stayed up late helping me with math homework, and who made pancakes every Saturday morning, wasn't actually my biological father. It wasn't a secret in a dramatic, "we're hiding something from you" kind of way. Mum told me early on. She said, "Ethan, you know your dad isn't your biological dad, right?" And I did. I understood it. Honestly, I never thought it mattered. He loved me, I loved him, and that was what counted. That was the version of family I grew up believing in, and I was okay with it. Mum's story was simple and, in a way, neatly wrapped up. My biological father hadn't wanted to be a dad. He had walked away the moment he found out Mum was pregnant. She said it wasn't personal, it wasn't about me, but rather that he just wasn't ready or willing, or maybe just didn't care. I believed her, and as far as I could see, it didn't change a thing. Life went on with Dad Mark, that's what I called him, being the kind of father most kids only dream about. The kind of guy who remembered every single detail about my life, who knew when I was sick before I even said a word, who argued with me over video games and then stayed up all night baking cookies when I was sad. He was my dad, capital D, and honestly, that was enough for me. I had love, I had stability, and for a long time, that was all that mattered. But as anyone who's ever grown up knows, life has this way of throwing in unexpected challenges when you least expect them. Around the time I was 12, things started to get complicated, not in the way of middle school drama or a bad haircut, but in a way that mattered a lot more. Health issues started creeping in. Nothing immediately terrifying at first, just little things that piled up: frequent infections, persistent fatigue, unexplained fevers. And then came the questions, the forms. Do you have a family history of this? Has anyone in your family had that? At first, it seemed simple, but every doctor I visited, every specialist I was referred to, wanted a full picture of my medical background. And there it was again, the gap in my history. My biological father was a ghost in my medical records, a missing piece of the puzzle. Mum said she had reached out to him, asked him for information, tried to get answers, but he refused to cooperate. It felt like another layer of rejection wrapped around a body that was already fighting. And in those quiet, sleepless nights, I couldn't help but think, the man who I'd never met, whose choices I didn't even have a say in, was apparently willing to let me struggle just because he could. As I sat in the sterile, bright-lit room of yet another doctor's office, the smell of antiseptic sharp in the air, I felt the weight of that missing piece more than ever. My mom held my hand, her grip reassuring yet tinged with her own anxiety. My dad Mark stood by my side, trying to crack a joke about the luxury of being a puzzle with a missing piece just to lighten the mood. But no joke could mask the frustration gnawing at me. Every doctor's form, every question about hereditary diseases, every new specialist who asked the same thing, It was like a reminder flashing in neon. Part of my story was unreachable. My biological father, the man who, according to everything I had been told, didn't want me, wasn't there. And now, apparently, he was refusing to be there in the one way that mattered most, providing vital information about my own body. It wasn't just inconvenience. It wasn't just paperwork. It was fear, quietly creeping in between appointments and whispered reassurances. There were nights when my fever spiked, when my throat ached so badly I could barely swallow, and I would lie in bed wondering if there was something in my genes that made me more vulnerable. If only I knew, I'd think, imagining a simple answer from a man I didn't know existed in my life. And every time, my mom would sigh and squeeze my shoulder, telling me she had tried, that she had reached out. But how do you make peace with someone's refusal to even acknowledge you? How do you come to terms with the idea that part of your own body's history is being deliberately withheld? Mark noticed the frustration simmering beneath my calm exterior. He never tried to gloss over it or tell me it wasn't a big deal. Instead, he would sit me down at night, sometimes after my mum had gone to bed, and talk. Really talk. About life, about family, about how some people make decisions that seem cruel but are more about themselves than the ones they hurt. You know, Ethan, he said one night, as we sat on the couch with the muted glow of the living room lamp, sometimes people don't do the right thing. And it's not because they're evil. Maybe they're scared. Maybe they're selfish. Maybe they just don't get it. But that doesn't mean you're any less worth knowing or loving. And there it was, again, the unwavering support of the man I called Dad. He helped me see that even if my biological father chose to walk away, I was not walking alone. And that somehow, in the quiet chaos of my body's uncertainties and the gaps in my family history, I could still feel safe. Yet, there was also an unavoidable sting. Every new doctor appointment became a reminder that I was missing critical information. I would explain, over and over, that I had only half my family medical history, that my mother's ex-partner, or my so-called biological father, refused to help. I could see the professional sympathy in their eyes, but sympathy doesn't fix a body that's trying to fight invisible battles. The feeling of being half documented, half known, was exhausting. It was a strange kind of isolation. This gap in my history, and it made me more aware than ever of what I didn't have. And as I sat in the waiting room, flipping through magazines I never really read, I realized something else. For all the love I had, for all the comfort Mark gave me, there was a missing truth that loomed larger every day. My mother's explanation, which I had believed unquestioningly for so long, began to feel fragile. It made sense on the surface. My biological father didn't want to be involved. He walked away. He refused to help. That story neatly wrapped up the gaps, created a narrative that my 12-year-old mind could accept. But I started noticing little cracks. The way my mother sometimes hesitated when talking about him. The little inconsistencies, small phrases. She would catch herself saying wrong. They weren't huge, obvious lies, but they felt like tiny warning lights blinking in a dark room. And I couldn't shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, the story wasn't as simple as I'd been told. Mark, perceptive as ever, noticed my growing unease. He didn't pry or push. He knew better than anyone that my curiosity, mixed with the fear of what I might find, had to be navigated carefully. But sometimes, in quiet moments, he would ask questions like, "Do you ever wonder what he's really like?" Or, "Do you think there's more to the story than we've been told?" And though my instinct was to push the thought away, The idea lodged itself in my mind, quietly gnawing. It was like a seed planted in fertile ground, growing slowly into a restless, uneasy curiosity. And so life continued, in a strange balance of normal teenage existence and quiet, gnawing questions. School, friends, video games, weekend soccer matches, they all went on. But in the background, the question of my biological father's involvement, or lack thereof, hovered like a shadow. I didn't know it yet, but those shadows were going to get brighter. The gaps in my history, the inconsistencies in my mother's story, the unanswered questions, they were all building toward a turning point. A point where what I thought I knew about my family, about my life, would collide with the reality I had never imagined, setting me on a path that would forever change how I saw my parents, myself, and the very idea of family. It was during one of those long, quiet nights, when the house felt too big and too empty, that I first seriously considered looking for him myself. My parents had always told me the story about my biological father as though it was set in stone, and for the most part, I had accepted it. But there's a strange thing that happens when you're a teenager facing your own vulnerabilities. You start to wonder about the what-ifs and the maybes that nobody else seems to think about. What if he wasn't exactly as Mum said? What if there were details she left out, not to harm me, but to protect herself, to protect the life she had built with Mark? Those questions refused to leave me alone. They lingered in the back of my mind, poking at me while I tried to sleep, whispering that maybe there was more to the story. Then, one afternoon, my Aunt Lisa, Mom's younger sister, a woman with sharp eyes and an uncanny ability to read people, pulled me aside after I came home from school. We were sitting at the kitchen table, the smell of leftover pasta from dinner still lingering in the air. She leaned in, lowering her voice so Mum couldn't. "Over here, Ethan," she said. "I know you've always believed what your mum told you, but things, they might not be exactly like you think. You might want to consider finding out for yourself." She paused, studying my reaction. "I'm not saying he's a bad guy or anything. I'm just saying the truth could be different. And the worst that could happen is he ignores you, or maybe he gets upset that you reached out. But at least then you'd know." Her words were like a spark in dry grass. I felt both terrified and excited. It was the kind of proposition that carried risk, but also possibility. I had never considered taking control of the story myself. I'd always been the passive observer, listening to the narrative my mother provided, letting her version shape my understanding of who I was and where I came from. But now, faced with the choice to actively seek the truth, I realized something crucial. I wanted agency. I wanted answers not just for curiosity, but for my own sense of self and for my health. The medical uncertainties, the repeated doctor visits, the frustration of having my history incomplete, all of it coalesced into a pressing need to take action. The following weeks were a blur of preparation and quiet research. I began by asking Aunt Lisa questions, more casual at first, trying to gauge how much she knew and how much she was willing to share. She was cautiously helpful, revealing only what was necessary to point me in the right direction, always careful not to cross lines or put anyone in danger. Through her, I learned that there might be family members on my biological father's side who had no idea about my existence. That alone felt surreal, the idea that I was a hidden chapter in someone else's life story, a story I'd never been told. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that my mother's version of events might have been selective, designed to protect her own choices or maintain the family dynamic she had established with Mark. Finally, I took the step that would irrevocably change the course of my life. I signed up for a DNA testing service. The process itself felt strangely intimate and slightly absurd. I sat at my desk, swabbing the inside of my cheek, staring at the little vial in my hand and wondering if I was really ready for what might come next. What if I discovered nothing? What if I discovered something so shocking that it shattered my perception of who my family was? And yet there was no turning back. The curiosity, the need for closure, the hope that I might finally fill in the missing pieces of my own story was too strong to ignore. Weeks later, the results came. I remember sitting on my bed, staring at the screen with a mixture of apprehension and disbelief, as the algorithm slowly worked its magic. And then there it was, a match. Not a distant cousin, not some obscure relative I'd never heard of, but a paternal aunt. And through her, a direct connection to the man I had been told was indifferent, unreachable, unwilling to be a part of. My life, the discovery, was like opening a door I never knew existed. Stepping into a hallway that connected me to a part of myself I had been missing for all 19 years of my life. There was shock, yes, but also a cautious hope, a tentative excitement that maybe, just maybe, the story was more complicated than the simple, neat narrative I had been given. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling, trying to process everything. The puzzle pieces were starting to shift, and I realized that the life I had known, the story I had accepted as truth, was only half the picture. Something bigger was waiting for me on the other side of the door I had just opened, and I had no idea whether what I would find would be healing, heartbreaking, or some strange mix of both. All I knew was that I had taken the first step, and there was no going back now. The first time I spoke with my paternal aunt, her voice on the phone carried a mixture of shock, disbelief, and cautious curiosity. Her name was Linda, and she lived in a small suburb just outside Chicago. I remember nervously adjusting the microphone on my computer, staring at the webcam like it could somehow shield me from the reality I was about to confront. "You're Ethan, right?" she asked after a long pause, as if saying my name aloud. Made this all real for her too. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. I didn't know you existed," she added, the words heavy with emotion. It was exactly what I feared and yet secretly hoped for, that my existence hadn't been acknowledged. That my mother's story wasn't just an omission but a full-on secret. Linda told me that she had no idea. My mum had been pregnant back then, and, as far as she knew, my father, my biological father, had never been informed. The news hit me in waves, first with relief, then confusion, then a deep, almost sickening curiosity about why no one had said anything. For all these years, I had grown up believing that my father had chosen not to be part of my life, that he didn't care, that he was absent by choice. And now the narrative was collapsing. He didn't know he hadn't chosen to leave. He wasn't even aware that I existed. My chest tightened, my mind spinning with a mixture of emotions I couldn't even name. Anger, relief, bewilderment. All of it at once. Linda became the bridge between me and the man I had long imagined as indifferent, someone I had resented in the quiet corners of my mind for years. She explained that she would help set up a meeting to ease both of our nerves, to provide a buffer. She said she didn't know how he would react, whether he would welcome the chance to meet me or retreat in confusion. "It's a lot to process," she said gently. "You have to understand, he's just as surprised as you are. But he cares about you, he cares that you exist, now that he knows. And if you want answers about your health, he'll help. He'll be there for that. The days leading up to the meeting were filled with anticipation, anxiety, and sleepless nights. I found myself replaying conversations in my head, imagining what he would look like, how he would speak, whether he would smile or frown when he saw me for the first time. I thought about all the times I had blamed him in my mind, all the bitterness that had slowly accumulated because of his supposed indifference. And now, facing the possibility that none of that had been true, I felt a strange mix of hope and trepidation. Would meeting him erase the resentment I had carried for so long? Would it open a wound I wasn't ready to confront? Finally, the day arrived. We agreed to meet at a quiet cafe in Chicago, the kind of place with mismatched chairs, warm lighting, and the faint smell of coffee beans in the air. I arrived early, fidgeting with my hands, trying to calm the nervous energy that buzzed under my skin. And then I saw him. He looked ordinary in a way that surprised me. Not the distant, cold figure I had imagined, but a man in his early 40s with kind eyes, a hesitant smile, and a subtle nervousness that mirrored my own. It was surreal, seeing the man who had unknowingly shaped part of my identity simply by not being present. Our first words were awkward, tentative, but honest. He apologized immediately, over and over, his tone sincere and filled with a quiet anguish I hadn't anticipated. "I never knew," he said. "No one told me you existed. I would have been there if I had known. I'm so sorry, Ethan." There it was, the truth unfiltered, raw and real. And as we sat together, talking about everything from childhood photos he'd never seen to my current health concerns, I realized that this man, who I had imagined as absent and uncaring, was now someone who would support me in ways I had never expected. He had medical records ready, notes about potential hereditary conditions, and the reassurance that if I ever needed it, he would be a donor. The irony wasn't lost on me. The man I had once thought had ignored me my whole life was now, in this moment, more helpful than anyone had ever been. And yet, amidst the relief and the surprising warmth, there was still a swirl of emotions I couldn't quiet. Confusion, resentment toward my mother, gratitude toward both him and Mark. The mixture was dizzying. I realized then that the story I had believed about my family, about who had chosen what and who had cared, had been incomplete. My life had been shaped by half-truths, by assumptions I had never questioned. And now, standing in that cafe, with the man who had unknowingly been my father sitting across from me, I understood that truth was rarely simple. It was messy, complicated, and sometimes beautiful and painful at the same time. By the end of the meeting, I had answers about my medical history, reassurance about my health, and a newfound understanding of my own narrative. But I also left with questions, lingering and heavy, about why my mother had kept this from me, why she had framed my father as uncaring when he hadn't even known. That part of the story still waited to be uncovered, a shadow in the bright light of newfound truths. And I knew, deep down, that the next chapter, confronting her, confronting the lies, and facing the consequences, was looming, inevitable and unavoidable. The days after meeting my biological father, whose name was Ryan, were a whirlwind of emotions, a constant tug-of-war between relief, confusion, and a kind of lingering disbelief. I kept replaying every moment from the cafe, the awkward laughs, the nervous apologies, the careful way he explained his medical history and the conditions I might be predisposed to. On one hand, I was grateful beyond grateful that this man was willing to help me, that he had been ready to step in for something that truly mattered, even if it was long overdue. On the other hand, I couldn't shake the questions that lingered like a storm cloud over my head. Why didn't my mother tell me? Why had she painted him as someone uncaring, a man who had chosen to ignore me, when the reality was completely different? I remember sitting in my room that night, staring at the ceiling as the city lights of Columbus twinkled faintly through my window. My mind was a jumble of thoughts. It wasn't just about the medical information anymore. It was about the lies, the omissions, and the narrative my mother had carefully constructed for 19 years. Every memory I had, every story she had, told me about why my father wasn't there, suddenly felt like it was built on sand. And the realization hit me hard. This wasn't just a personal betrayal. It was a reshaping of my identity. Everything I had believed about where I came from, about why my family was the way it was suddenly uncertain. The man who I had blamed for years for being absent had no knowledge, no part in the decision. And yet my mother's story had turned him into a figure of rejection and indifference. Mark, my dad, noticed the shift in me almost immediately. He had been supportive through every doctor's appointment, every whispered conversation with Aunt Lisa, but now there was a new tension in the air, the kind of tension that comes when someone's worldview, carefully maintained for years, is suddenly upended. He asked me gently one evening, "Ethan, how are you feeling after meeting him? Emotionally, I mean. Are you okay?" I hesitated before answering because I wasn't sure myself. "I don't know, Dad," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. "It's a lot. He's nothing like I imagined. And at the same time, it's like the past 19 years are different now. Like maybe I've been living a story that wasn't mine to live in the first place." Mark just nodded, his eyes reflecting both concern and understanding. "Truth has a way of doing that," he said softly. "It can hurt, it can heal, sometimes both at the same time." I spent the next few weeks getting to know Ryan in small ways: phone calls, text messages, exchanging childhood stories and family photos that had never reached me before. Each interaction was both thrilling and painful. Thrilling because I was discovering parts of my own identity I had never seen. Painful because it emphasized how much had been kept from me, how much of my own story I had been denied. He sent me documents about family medical history, detailed charts and notes that explained certain hereditary conditions and risks that had affected others in his family. My medical team was thrilled. For the first time in years, I felt like I was not just half known, half documented, but whole, in terms of having the information necessary to properly take care of myself. That sense of security, however, was entangled with a gnawing anger at my mother. It took courage and a certain, calculated patience to finally bring the topic up with my mum. The first conversation was tense. She reacted predictably at first, with denials and defensive questions. "Why did you go looking for him without telling me? Are you trying to create a wedge between us?" I could feel the adrenaline spike. In my chest, the familiar heat of anger bubbling beneath the surface. I explained carefully why I did it, not out of malice, but necessity, because my health depended on the truth, and because I needed to know the full story. After a long silence, she admitted the truth. The story she had told me for all these years, the narrative of an uncaring father who walked away, was false. She explained that she had met Ryan after a different relationship had ended, and in order to maintain the family life she had with Mark, she had decided to construct a version of events that made everything appear normal. She confessed that she had never told Ryan about me, even after I had gotten sick, because she wanted to keep the delicate balance of her family intact. Hearing her confession was like a punch to the chest. It was not just the betrayal that hurt, it was the implications of that betrayal. My health had been at stake, my sense of identity had been manipulated, and the relationships around me had been carefully orchestrated to maintain an illusion. And in that moment, I realized the truth wasn't just a revelation about Ryan, it was a revelation about the power of secrets, the weight of lies, and the way a single story can shape an entire life. The tangled emotions that followed, rage, confusion, relief, were overwhelming. It was the kind of moment that changes you, that leaves a mark so deep you know you can never go back to seeing the world the way you did before. After confronting my mom and hearing her admission, the air in our house felt heavier than ever. The weight of years of secrecy and half-truths pressed down on all of us. Mark, my dad, had been standing quietly in the background during our conversation, listening, processing, and I could see the storm brewing behind his calm exterior. He was hurt not just for me, not just for the betrayal, but for himself, for having unknowingly been complicit in a web of lies he had believed was never spun. His trust in my mum had been unwavering, and now that trust had been fractured. And me, I felt a mix of vindication, anger, and a strange sense of liberation all at once. It was exhausting, emotionally, to process the betrayal, but also strangely empowering to finally know the truth about Ryan, about my medical history, and about my place in the world. For days after the confrontation, the house felt like a pressure cooker of tension and unspoken words. My siblings, younger than me, could sense that something had shifted, though they didn't have the full picture. I overheard whispers in the hallway, questions muttered under their breaths about why I had gone behind Mom's back to find Ryan, why the family seemed so unsettled. There was guilt creeping in, to an uncomfortable awareness that my pursuit of truth, though necessary, had set off a chain reaction that left the household in turmoil. But at the same time, I couldn't ignore the relief, the clarity, and the sense of ownership over my own life and identity that I now felt. I was no longer living solely under the narrative constructed for me. I had taken the reins, and for the first time, my story felt my own. Meanwhile, my relationship with Ryan grew cautiously optimistic. We started communicating regularly, sharing stories about our lives, our childhoods, our interests, and slowly bridging the gap of 19 years. He was warm, patient, and deeply apologetic for the lost time. He never tried to replace Mark or disrupt the family that had raised me, but he expressed a genuine desire to be part of my life moving forward, and the medical information he provided was invaluable. For the first time, my doctors had a complete view of my health history, and I felt a sense of control over something that had long been unpredictable. It was like having a missing piece finally restored, a clarity I hadn't realized I was desperate for until I had it. Yet, the satisfaction of this newfound truth came at a steep cost. The cracks in my family were widening, and Mark made it clear that he felt deeply betrayed by Mum. It wasn't just about the lies to me. It was about the deceit in their marriage, the secrets that had been kept from him for years. He felt manipulated, as though the trust and bond he had shared with Mum had been used to maintain an illusion, at the expense of both his relationship with me and the health complications I had faced without full information. His anger was a mix of protective, paternal instinct and personal betrayal, and it was palpable. I could see it in the tight set of his jaw, the way he avoided eye contact with Mum, and the quiet intensity of his movements around the house. The conversations that followed were tense and sometimes explosive. Arguments erupted over decisions that had been made years ago, over choices that had affected all of us without our knowledge. My siblings vacillated between sympathy and resentment toward me. They didn't understand, and in some ways, I couldn't blame them. From their perspective, their world had been upended, their sense of stability shaken, all because I had uncovered truths that had been carefully hidden. And yet, I knew that if I hadn't pursued the answers, I would have continued living in ignorance, facing potential health crises without the full picture, and carrying unearned resentment toward a man who had never consciously wronged me through all of this. I learned a difficult lesson. Truth is never neutral. It can heal, it can liberate, but it also has the power to wound, to fracture relationships, and to force difficult reckonings. And as I navigated my new relationship with Ryan, the complicated dynamic with Mark, and the growing tension with my mum, I realized that adulthood, real understanding, real ownership of your life, comes with the responsibility of facing those truths, no matter how uncomfortable or painful they may be. By the end of that week, the household had settled into a fragile equilibrium, one that was far from perfect, but grounded in a more honest understanding of our lives. I felt stronger, more aware, and cautiously hopeful that, in time, the wounds would heal. And for the first time, I truly believed that despite the upheaval and emotional turbulence, the pursuit of truth had been worth every tear, every argument, and every moment of doubt. After the initial shock of meeting Ryan and confronting my mum, life didn't simply settle back into some predictable rhythm. Instead, it felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing the ground beneath me had shifted, and that every step forward would require careful navigation. I had to process not only the revelations about my biological father, but also the ripple effects of those truths on my daily life, my family, and my understanding of who I really was. The clarity I had gained regarding my health was a relief. Yes, but the emotional landscape that came with it was far more treacherous than I had anticipated. Every interaction with my mum, with Mark, even with my siblings, carried a weight that hadn't existed before. The air was thick with unspoken grievances, lingering questions, and the delicate balancing act of maintaining civility, while facing a family dynamic that had been UPN-DED. Ryan, for his part, was cautiously present in my life, an unfamiliar but strangely comforting figure. He had shared everything he knew about his family's medical history, and we had spent hours on the phone discussing potential hereditary issues, treatments, and preventive measures. My doctors had praised the completeness of the information, and I finally felt a sense of control over my own body, a rare and precious feeling that I hadn't known I was missing. Yet, this newfound sense of empowerment was inseparable from the realization of the deception that had colored my life until that point. I had lived for nearly 2 decades believing that my father had chosen not to be involved, and now I knew that his absence had been an accident, a result of secrets and lies perpetuated by my mum. It was a bitter pill to swallow, and it left me with a gnawing sense of betrayal that I had to process in isolation. Even as I engaged with Ryan in a tentative, hopeful connection, Mark, who had been my unwavering support through every health scare, soccer game, and teenage meltdown, was now navigating his own storm of emotions. He had loved me like a biological son, and I had loved him as my father in every way that mattered. But the revelation of my mother's deception cut deep into the foundation of their marriage. Mark was furious not at me, not at Ryan, but at my mum for the lies, for the way she had manipulated the narrative of our family for years, and for keeping him complicit in a deception he had unknowingly maintained. I could see it in the way he moved around the house, in the quiet intensity of his glances, in the tight set of his jaw when my mum spoke. Their once harmonious partnership now seemed like a fragile glass sculpture, beautiful but perilously close to shattering under the weight of truth and anger at the same time. I was forced to confront my own feelings of guilt and responsibility. My siblings, younger than me, didn't fully understand why I had taken the steps to reach out to Ryan. From their perspective, our family's life had been disrupted, and they were angry. I overheard whispers in the hallway, questions muttered in frustration, and thinly veiled resentment that seemed to follow me wherever I went. I couldn't blame them. They were teenagers dealing with upheaval they had not asked for, but it added another layer to the emotional complexity of our household. I had wanted answers, closure, and control over my own story, yet the cost of acquiring those truths was visible in the strained expressions and cautious interactions of the people I loved. Despite the chaos, there were moments of unexpected warmth and clarity. Conversations with Ryan, though initially awkward, became increasingly natural. He shared stories about his own life, the childhood memories I had never had the chance to experience with him, and the details of our shared family history. Each story filled in blanks I hadn't even known existed, providing pieces of identity that felt both strange and familiar at the same time. And while Mark and I navigated our own complicated emotions about my mother's deception, there were moments when we leaned on each other, silently acknowledging that our bond was unshakable despite the upheaval. Mark's unwavering presence reminded me that family was defined not just by blood, but by love, support, and the choices we make to be present in each other's lives. At night, when the house settled into silence and the faint hum of city life drifted through my window, I often reflected on how fragile, yet resilient, our family had become. Truth had a way of exposing cracks and weaknesses, but it also illuminated the depth of care, the strength of bonds, and the capacity for growth and forgiveness. The road ahead was uncertain. I knew there would be difficult conversations, tense moments, and perhaps permanent changes in the structure of our family, but I also recognized a strange beauty in that uncertainty. It was a chance to reconstruct our relationships on a foundation of honesty, to redefine what family meant to each of us, and to carve out a space for connections that had once seemed impossible. By the end of that week, I began to notice subtle shifts. The air in the house, while still heavy at times, carried a tentative sense of possibility. I was connecting with Ryan in meaningful ways, understanding my health with newfound clarity, and developing a more nuanced perspective on my mother's choices, complicated as they were. And in moments with Mark, there was a quiet acknowledgement that, despite the hurt and betrayal, the love we shared had endured. I understood, more clearly than ever, that truth was multifaceted, and while it could wound, it could also liberate and heal. I was learning to navigate that duality, one day at a time, discovering that the act of uncovering hidden truths could bring both chaos and unexpected clarity, reshaping the family I had always known into something more honest, if still imperfect. As the days stretched into weeks, the tension in the house became palpable, a constant, invisible presence that shaped every interaction. Mum's demeanor had shifted noticeably. She was quieter, more measured, as if carefully weighing each word before speaking, perhaps out of fear, perhaps from guilt. Mark, meanwhile, was oscillating between stoic calm and bursts of frustration that I had never witnessed before. It was as if the very foundation of our family had been shaken, and now everyone was trying to find footing on unfamiliar ground. The house no longer felt like the secure, predictable space it had once been. Every hallway, every room, seemed charged with the weight of secrets finally revealed. Even my siblings, who were trying to process the upheaval, had grown more guarded, casting glances that were a mixture of confusion, resentment, and curiosity. It was a delicate balance. No one wanted to say the wrong thing, and yet everything we did or didn't say seemed to carry consequences. My relationship with Mum, in particular, was strained in ways I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just anger or hurt, it was a profound sense of betrayal that cut deeper than I could have imagined. For years, she had been my guide through life's challenges, my comfort in moments of uncertainty, the steady hand that helped me navigate both mundane and critical experiences. And yet, the foundation of trust we had built over nearly 2 decades had been compromised, undermined by a secret she had chosen to keep for reasons I still struggled to understand. She had painted Ryan as a man who didn't care, who had chosen not to be part of my life, when the reality was that he had been unaware of my existence. That deception, while perhaps intended to protect her carefully constructed family life, left me grappling with a complex cocktail of emotions: anger, sorrow, confusion, and a strange, reluctant empathy. I wanted to scream, to confront her with the years of unspoken consequences, yet a part of me understood that human choices are rarely simple, and that her motives, however flawed, had been tied to survival, control, and perhaps fear of losing the stability we had. Mark's presence, in contrast, provided a counterbalance to the emotional turbulence. He had always been my anchor, and now, more than ever, I relied on him for perspective, reassurance, and support. In quiet moments, we would talk about everything: the injustice of being lied to, the new bond I was forming with Ryan, and the fragile state of Mum's conscience. He reminded me, gently but firmly, that my feelings were valid, that my pursuit of truth was justified, and that I deserved to know my own story in full. He never pressured me to forgive or forget, but he encouraged me to navigate the unfolding reality with clarity and patience, acknowledging both the pain and the possibilities that lay ahead. It was a delicate dance, one of maintaining connection while acknowledging the fractures that now existed. My bond with Ryan, meanwhile, continued to grow in subtle but significant ways. We shared conversations that spanned hours, touching on everything from family history to hobbies and personal experiences. He never tried to overshadow Mark's role in my life or claim a place he had lost through no fault of his own. Instead, he approached our relationship with humility and openness, offering support where it was needed, and sharing insights about our shared medical history that had tangible implications for my health. The act of learning about my genetic makeup, inherited conditions, and preventative measures was empowering, yet it also amplified the complexity of my emotions. I was forming a connection with a man I had been told to resent, a man whose absence had been falsely framed as neglect, and whose presence now offered both guidance and reassurance. It was both comforting and disorienting, a paradox that required careful mental navigation. Family dinners, once routine and uneventful, became charged events, filled with subtle tension and unspoken grievances. The conversations were polite, but measured, each word weighed against the backdrop of the revelation that had upended our lives. My siblings, sensing the fragility of the household dynamic, often retreated into their own spaces, leaving Mum and Mark and me to navigate the emotional terrain. I could feel the tension coiling in the air, palpable, as if we were all collectively holding our breath, waiting for the next unexpected fracture. And yet, amidst the chaos, there were moments of connection, brief, fleeting, but profoundly significant. Mark would glance at me with quiet pride and solidarity. Ryan would share a humorous anecdote that drew reluctant laughter. And even Mum would occasionally reveal a glimpse of vulnerability, a reminder that, despite the fractures, there was still a thread of humanity binding us together. Through all of this, I learned that truth is both a liberating and destabilizing force. It can illuminate paths that were previously obscured, offering clarity and agency, yet it also exposes hidden fault lines, vulnerabilities, and the consequences of long-held deception. The process of reconciling these dualities became central to my existence, shaping my interactions, my decisions, and my understanding of familial bonds. I realized that the pursuit of truth, while painful and disruptive, was necessary not only for my own well-being, but for the potential restoration of authentic relationships, grounded in honesty and mutual understanding. By the end of that chapter, I had begun to accept that some wounds might never fully heal, that some tensions would persist, and that forgiveness, if it came at all, would be gradual and complex. Yet, I also recognized the value of knowledge, the empowerment that came from understanding my health, my lineage, and my place within a broader familial tapestry. The journey was far from over, but I had crossed a critical threshold from ignorance to awareness, from passive acceptance to active engagement, from a life shaped by incomplete stories to one informed by the full, complicated, and often contradictory truth. The tension that had been simmering in our household finally erupted one late evening. A few weeks after the dust had settled from the initial revelations, Mark had reached his breaking point. The quiet patience he had maintained, the careful restraint, had given way to a raw, unfiltered expression of the anger and betrayal he felt. Mum and I were sitting in the living room when he came home from work, his face tight with frustration, his hands gripping the steering wheel of his car as though the physical act could contain the storm inside him. "I can't do this anymore," he said, his voice steady but searing, cutting through the tense silence like a knife. "I can't stay in a marriage built on lies, deception, and secrets. I loved you, but this isn't just about Ethan. It's about everything we built together, and it's gone." Mum froze, her expression shifting between disbelief and the slow, dawning realization that her carefully constructed facade was collapsing. For years, she had maintained control over the narrative of our family, shaping each detail to protect her version of normalcy. But in that moment, she was confronted with the undeniable consequences of her choices. Mark's words were not just a reprimand, they were a declaration. A line drawn in the sand that separated the past she had controlled from the uncertain future she now faced alone. I could see the fear in her eyes, the weight of accountability pressing down, and the realization that no explanation or justification could undo the damage that had been done. The following days were a blur of arrangements, whispered phone calls, and emotionally charged discussions. Mark had made the decision to move out of the house, seeking space to process his emotions and to determine how, or if, reconciliation was possible. I helped him pack some of his things, trying to remain neutral but also acknowledging the painful reality of our fractured family. Each box, each item carefully placed into a moving van, felt like a tangible representation of the separation that had already begun. Mum watched silently, sometimes with tears, sometimes with anger, sometimes with a mixture of both. And I realized that the consequences of her secrecy were now unavoidable, spreading like ripples across the surface of our once stable lives. My siblings were confused and hurt. From their perspective, the family they had known was crumbling because of truths they hadn't been prepared to understand. They whispered in corners, shot sidelong glances, and occasionally accused me of being the catalyst for the upheaval. "Why did you have to find him?" one of my younger siblings asked, her voice trembling with a mix of hurt and frustration. Everything was fine before this. I wanted to explain, to make her understand that nothing was fine, that our family had been built on omissions and lies that affected not just me, but everyone, and that finding Ryan wasn't about punishment, but about truth, identity, and health. But words felt inadequate. How could I make them understand that the chaos unfolding around us was a necessary consequence of uncovering long-buried realities? Ryan remained a steady presence in my life, a comforting contrast to the turbulence at home. We communicated daily, sharing stories, advice, and support. His presence reminded me that family was complex, layered, and not defined solely by proximity or the circumstances of upbringing. He had been absent, yes, but his willingness to step in, to provide medical guidance, and to form a bond with me now was a powerful reminder that human relationships are dynamic and evolving. In moments of quiet reflection, I realized that while my connection with him could never replace the years lost, it offered something equally important: agency, choice, and the chance to build a relationship grounded in honesty, however belatedly, amidst the chaos. I also had to confront my own emotions, the lingering anger toward my mum, the grief for the dissolution of her marriage with Mark, and the simultaneous relief that I now had access to the truth I had sought for so long. It was a paradoxical state, where I felt both liberated and burdened, empowered and vulnerable. I learned that truth, while necessary, carries weight, and that the act of seeking it can reshape relationships in unpredictable ways. My mum's deception, though perhaps motivated by a desire to maintain family stability, had ultimately destabilized the very bonds she sought to protect, leaving us all to navigate a landscape of fractured trust and uncertain futures. By the end of that week, the house had shifted into a new rhythm, fragile, tentative, and filled with uncertainty. Mark had officially moved out, leaving Mum, my siblings, and me to adjust to a new reality. Conversations were cautious, gestures measured, and every interaction carried the silent weight of past revelations. Yet, amidst the tension, there were small signs of resilience, fleeting moments of understanding between Mum and me, a brief smile shared with a sibling, a reassuring text from Ryan reminding me that I was not alone in navigating the aftermath. I began to understand that healing, if it was to come, would be gradual, uneven, and complex. It would require patience, empathy, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths head-on. And I knew, deep down, that while the path ahead was uncertain, the pursuit of truth, however painful, had already transformed me in ways that would shape the rest of my life. The days following Mark's move were heavy, like an invisible fog had settled over the house, permeating every corner with the weight of loss and unresolved tension. Mum moved through the rooms with quiet deliberation, her movements precise, but lacking the warmth that had once characterized her presence. My siblings and I navigated a landscape that felt alien. Meals were eaten in silence. Laughter was rare, and every word spoken seemed carefully measured to avoid triggering old wounds or igniting new arguments. I felt the absence of Mark keenly, not just because he had been my father in every meaningful sense, but because he had been a stabilizing force, a buffer against the chaos that had always threatened to creep in. His departure left a void that even Ryan's presence couldn't fill, and I realized that family, no matter how resilient, is often defined as much by who is absent as by who is present. Mum and I had a few difficult conversations during this period, each one a negotiation between confrontation and understanding. She tried to explain her motives, claiming that she had wanted to protect the family, to maintain stability, and to avoid complicating my life with truths she thought I wasn't ready to handle. Her words rang hollow in the early moments, tinged with defensiveness and the faint echo of guilt. But as the conversations continued, I began to see the complexity of her choices. She had acted not purely out of malice, but from fear, insecurity, and a desire to control outcomes she couldn't fully manage. Understanding this didn't erase the pain, but it allowed me to approach our interactions with a nuanced perspective, a recognition that people can be flawed, their choices harmful, yet sometimes understandable within the context of their own experiences and limitations. Even with this emerging perspective, the rift in our family was undeniable. My siblings vacillated between confusion, resentment, and reluctant acceptance, struggling to make sense of a reality that had appended their childhood assumptions. They occasionally blamed me, suggesting that my pursuit of truth had set off the chain of events leading to Mark's departure. These moments were painful, a reminder that the path to clarity is rarely without collateral damage. I tried to explain, gently and patiently, that seeking the truth was not an act of betrayal, but an effort to reclaim knowledge and agency that had long been denied to me. Still, the road to mutual understanding was long, fraught with delicate negotiations of emotion and perception. Ryan remained a stabilizing presence, the one constant amid shifting tides. We continued to exchange messages, talk about my health, share stories, and slowly build a connection that was both comforting and grounding. His involvement was careful, respectful, and nurturing, never attempting to replace Mark, but providing the guidance and support I had been missing for nearly 2 decades. Each conversation with him was a reminder that relationships can be repaired, forged anew, and nurtured even after years of absence. And while the presence of truth had fractured parts of my family, it also opened doors for connections that had previously been impossible. Through the turbulence, I began to understand the broader implications of truth and secrecy within families. Lies, even those intended to protect, can cause profound disruption when revealed. Conversely, confronting hidden realities, though painful, can pave the way for healing, growth, and genuine connection. I realized that while Mark and Mum's marriage had ended, and while some relationships would require time, patience, and careful negotiation to repair, the pursuit of truth had provided me with invaluable tools: clarity about my health, a connection to my biological father, and a deeper understanding of human complexity. As I reflected on the upheaval, I felt a mixture of grief, relief, and cautious hope. The family I had known was irrevocably changed, yet in that change lay the potential for authenticity and honesty that had previously been absent. I recognized that healing would be gradual, uneven, and fraught with setbacks. But I also understood that the courage to face uncomfortable truths was a necessary step toward reconciliation, both with my mother, with Mark, and with myself. In quiet moments, I would sit with Ryan on the phone, listening to his calm voice, and feel a sense of groundedness that had been absent for years. It reminded me that even amid chaos, the human capacity for connection, empathy, and resilience remains, offering the possibility of rebuilding not what was lost, but what could be genuinely created anew. By the end of this chapter, I had reached a tentative equilibrium. Mark was beginning to process his own path forward. Mum was learning to confront the consequences of her choices, and my siblings and I were navigating a complex web of emotions, slowly learning to communicate openly. I had gained not only medical knowledge critical to my well-being, but also a profound understanding of the fragile, often contradictory nature of familial bonds. The journey through betrayal, revelation, and emotional upheaval had been painful, but it had also illuminated the potential for growth, understanding, and the construction of a family dynamic grounded in honesty, however imperfect that new reality might be. By the time the dust had settled from the upheaval at home, I had entered a phase of reflection unlike anything I had experienced before. Life felt simultaneously heavier and heavier because the emotional weight of revelations and broken trust pressed down on my chest like an invisible anchor, and lighter because I had finally claimed a truth that had always been mine to uncover. The confrontation with my mum, the excruciating realization of her deception, and the rupture in Mark's marriage had all been tumultuous, but they had also opened a door to clarity, to agency, and to understanding my own story in ways I never imagined possible. Sitting in my room, surrounded by the quiet hum of the city, I often replayed the first moments I met Ryan, the nervous laughter, the awkward introductions, the tentative attempts to connect after so many years lost. Those memories were bittersweet, tinged with both grief for lost time and gratitude for the present opportunity. Ryan had become a constant in my life, a stabilizing figure who offered knowledge, guidance, and connection that I had been denied. For years, we spent long hours discussing everything from family medical history to the mundane details of daily life. His patience and willingness to step into a role he had never anticipated were grounding, providing a counterbalance to the emotional turbulence that still lingered at home. Each conversation with him reinforced the realization that relationships can be forged even after years of absence, that trust can be built, and that love can exist in forms that are unexpected yet profoundly meaningful. He was not there to replace Mark, nor did he attempt to, but his presence reminded me that family is multifaceted, layered, and often redefined by the choices we make and the connections we nurture. Meanwhile, the dynamics at home continued to evolve. Mum was learning to confront the consequences of her actions, navigating guilt, remorse, and the fragile attempts at rebuilding some semblance of trust. Mark had moved out, seeking space and clarity, but our bond remained strong. I realized that love, in its truest form, often transcends anger and disappointment. While his relationship with Mum had ended, his relationship with me and mine with him remained intact, resilient against the turmoil. My siblings, too, were gradually adjusting, navigating the complex emotions of confusion, blame, and eventual understanding. It was clear that healing would be uneven and ongoing, but the framework for reconciliation and rebuilding had been laid. In this period of reflection, I also had to reconcile my own feelings about the past. I grappled with anger toward Mum for the secrecy, for the years of half-truths, and for the way my health had been potentially jeopardized by the lack of accurate medical information. But intertwined with that anger was empathy, an understanding that human decisions are rarely purely right or wrong, and that fear, love, and the desire to maintain control can drive people to act in ways that are harmful yet understandable. I began to see Mum not only as the source of betrayal, but also as a human being, flawed and complicated, who had made choices that affected all of us in profound ways. Accepting this duality of hurt and empathy was perhaps one of the most challenging and transformative lessons of this entire experience. The integration of Ryan into my life brought both practical and emotional shifts. Medically, having access to a complete family history provided clarity and reassurance, allowing my doctors to make informed decisions and enabling me to take proactive steps toward my health. Emotionally, it was a bridge to understanding a part of myself that had been obscured for 19 years. Conversations about shared traits, inherited conditions, and family stories became moments of connection and discovery. With each story, each detail shared, I felt a sense of belonging and continuity that had been absent, and a newfound confidence in navigating both my identity and my future. Ryan's presence underscored a critical truth that even delayed connections, formed under complicated circumstances, can be deeply meaningful and transformative. As weeks turned into months, a fragile but growing equilibrium emerged. I learned to navigate my complex feelings toward Mum, maintaining honesty while establishing boundaries. I cultivated my bond with Mark, understanding that love and family are resilient even when structures change. I continued to foster my relationship with Ryan, integrating his presence into my life, while honoring the relationships that had shaped me. And in the quiet moments alone, I reflected on the transformative power of truth, the way it can both wound and heal, fracture and unite, disrupt and clarify. It was clear that life after revelation was never simple, never neat, but it was authentic, grounded in honesty, and rich with potential for growth and meaningful connection. By the time I looked back at the events that had brought us here, I realized that the pursuit of truth, despite its pain and upheaval, had reshaped my world for the better. I had gained knowledge critical to my health, forged a meaningful connection with my biological father, and begun the delicate, ongoing work of rebuilding relationships within the family I had always known. The journey had been fraught, emotionally, exhausting, and transformative, leaving no aspect of my life untouched. Yet, amidst the complexity, I understood a profound truth, that in facing reality head-on, however challenging, we carve a path toward empowerment, understanding, and the possibility of authentic relationships. And while some wounds may never fully heal, the courage to confront the past and embrace the truth offers a foundation upon which the future uncertain yet promising can be built. As the months passed, life slowly began to take on a new rhythm, though it was a rhythm punctuated by both absence and presence, by loss and newfound connections. Mark had settled into his own space, navigating the emotional aftermath of a marriage, broken not by a lack of love, but by the devastating weight of deception. He remained a central figure in my life, our bond resilient and unshakable despite the upheaval. The house felt different without him, quieter and perhaps lonelier. Yet his influence and support continued to anchor me, reminding me that family is not only defined by shared residence, but by unwavering presence, care, and commitment. Mum, for her part, had begun the slow process of reckoning with her past choices. There were days filled with difficult conversations, moments of tension and remorse, and even heated arguments as we worked through the layers of hurt and misunderstanding. I learned to engage with her honestly, acknowledging the pain she had caused, while also recognizing her humanity, her fears, and her flawed attempts at protecting the family. It was a delicate balance, walking the line between empathy and self-preservation. But it taught me a vital lesson about forgiveness, not as a requirement to erase the past, but as a tool to reclaim personal peace and navigate relationships with clarity and intentionality. Ryan had become a consistent presence in my life, his support unwavering and his patience remarkable. We spent countless hours talking, sharing stories about our family, exploring medical history, and discovering the nuances of our shared traits. These interactions were deeply grounding, providing me not only with critical knowledge about my health, but also with a sense of belonging to a broader narrative of family and identity that had been hidden from me for nearly 2 decades. His involvement reminded me that relationships can be nurtured even when they are delayed, and that the bonds we choose to cultivate today can hold profound significance, regardless of the years lost to circumstance. Through all of this, I reflected deeply on the nature of truth and the transformative power it holds. Seeking the truth had been painful, disruptive, and emotionally exhausting. Yet it had provided clarity, empowerment, and agency. I had confronted uncomfortable realities about my family, my mother's choices, and the complexities of human relationships. I had navigated anger, grief, and confusion, learning to reconcile feelings of betrayal with empathy and resentment with understanding. This journey had been a crucible, shaping not only my understanding of my family, but also my approach to life, relationships, and self-knowledge. My siblings, though initially resentful and confused, gradually began to adjust, learning to navigate the new family dynamics with caution and, eventually, acceptance. While some wounds remained, there were moments of connection, laughter shared over a family meal, a quiet understanding in a glance, a willingness to listen and empathize. Slowly, the threads of trust and familiarity began to weave a delicate tapestry of possibility, hinting at the potential for repair, reconciliation, and a redefined sense of family that was grounded in honesty rather than illusion. Ultimately, the journey had taught me that family, identity, and personal history are complex and often layered. It revealed that love and care exist in multiple forms, that absence does not preclude significance, and that the pursuit of truth, though difficult, is a courageous act that shapes the trajectory of one's life. I realized that while the past could not be changed, the present and future could be consciously constructed, informed by the knowledge and insights I had fought to uncover. The connections I nurtured with Mark, with Ryan, and even cautiously with Mumby, came the scaffolding upon which I could build a life grounded in authenticity and informed by clarity. Looking forward, I understood that the road ahead would not be without challenges. There would be moments of tension, lingering questions, and ongoing emotional negotiation. But I also recognized a profound sense of agency and resilience that had emerged from the ordeal. I had claimed my story, my identity, and my health. I had confronted the lies that had shaped my early life and, in doing so, forged a path toward empowerment and understanding. And as I envisioned the future, I felt a cautious optimism, a belief that, though the journey had been painful and transformative, the truths I had uncovered would serve as a foundation for relationships built on honesty, empathy, and the enduring bonds of chosen and biological family alike. In the end, I realized that the pursuit of truth is never simple, never neat, and rarely painless. Yet, it is through this pursuit that we find clarity, agency, and the opportunity to redefine the relationships that matter most. My life, reshaped by revelation and courage, was no longer governed by secrecy or half-truths. I had confronted the past, embraced the complexities of the present, and stepped into a future defined not by deception, but by understanding, resilience, and the enduring potential for authentic connection. And in that realization, amidst the quiet moments of reflection and the ongoing process of family rebuilding, I found a sense of peace, a recognition that truth, however difficult, had finally set me free.